What aspect of sea level rise or climate change do you investigate? I look at the role of microorganisms in carbon cycling. And what that means is I look at how microorganisms move carbon through tidal wetlands. And the reason that's important is because ultimately all carbon eventually goes through the microbial community. Whether that's through plant litter, plant death, that carbon eventually ends up going to microorganisms, which will then either respire it to the atmosphere or store it in the sediments. So ultimately, whether a wetland is going to be a source of carbon to the atmosphere or a net sink is going to be up to the microbes. So if we don't understand the microbiology, we don't understand the system. Tell us what ecosystem components you focus on and why. So the ecosystem component that I work on, as I mentioned, is microorganisms. So we're specifically looking at how microorganisms react and respond to changes in tidal wetland cycling. I'm interested in how they change with different environmental parameters like related to climate change, like temperature, and how they respond to changes in the plant community. But overall, what we do is basically use ecological techniques, but using those on the microbial community. Tell us how you typically conduct your research in the field. Basically, what we have to do is use genetics, because you can't just put a microscope into the sediments and look at microorganisms. So what we usually do is go to the field, collect samples, bring them back to the lab, extract DNA, and use techniques in genetics to be able to reconstruct what the microbial community looks like. And through that, we can build snapshots up with the community using their gene content to understand what the bacterial community looks like in the field. So a lot of our work actually happens in the lab from small field samples we collect at the time of sampling. Please tell us how your work helps us better understand climate change. So the big picture in this is that if we're trying to manage wetlands and how they're going to respond or how we can mitigate climate change using wetlands, if we're not incorporating microorganisms, we're not taking account to some of the most important organisms in the system. It's easy to see plants and their effects and how they're changing, but it's a lot harder to see the microorganisms, so often they're overlooked by land managers. So we're trying to integrate microorganisms into the big picture of how we're managing wetlands. Next steps. Tell us how your findings are currently being used. So what we're trying to really get a handle on is how microorganisms are responding to climate change. We've got a very good picture of what microorganisms are there, so we're getting good at sort of naming the microorganisms in our wetlands, but we still don't know exactly what they're doing functionally and how they're responding to changes in wetlands. So things like restoration or sea level rise, how are the microorganisms going to change and adapt to those different consequences? And then when those happen, how is that going to affect how they're functioning in wetlands? So we're trying to build a more mechanistic model of how microorganisms will change with climate change and sea level rise. Parting words. To leave you with an optimistic future. I actually think this is a great time to be involved in climate change science. I think people actually are starting to pay attention. I think there's opportunities there, and people are starting to realize that we are going to have to adapt. We have 16-year-olds going to the UN and causing a lot of change, and we have protests and climate change summits. So I think right now people are finally maybe starting to listen to scientists, and it's going to be scientists that ultimately drive these changes, because if we don't know how these systems work, there's no point discussing it. So scientists are going to be at the front and center of anything we do in climate change.